All right. Good evening. Maybe. I think. I don't know. What's happening? Okay, we're there. Good evening, everybody. We have a little bit of technical difficulties today, so we're actually broadcasting off a little bit different of a platform. But I think we got it figured out. I'm just trying to get something to work here real quick. If I can figure. Oh, there we are. Just need to share this real fast. Glad to have everybody with us tonight. We're going to have a really amazing show um, because it's not a lot of times. I mean, a lot of times we've been doing shows and the moms or dads or whoever are in the middle of the battle and we're trying to get them help and we're trying to get the word out. But this evening, we have Rachel Bruno, who many of you have probably heard about and heard about the victories that she has won in her case with the help of attorney Sean McMillan, who many of you are familiar with as well. And I think it's really important to show parents, um, not just like in our own case, but you got to fight. And you can get your kids back. And you can hold these people accountable and to never give up and to never quit and to never surrender because we are making a difference. And I don't know how long some of our viewers have been engaged in this human rights ordeal. And this really is an issue about human rights, about human trafficking, about deprivation of civil liberties, about the most sacred bond that even the Supreme Court has said over and over and over that it is a protected bond between a parent and the care and control of a child for that parent, and that the state really has no right to interfere with that unless there's some compelling interest like child abuse. And then we have this entire industry that becomes crafted on not only taking children away from families that love them and are not abusing them, I believe, based on the adoptability of the children in some cases, or maybe the social worker just doesn't like the parent, or they're just so used to trafficking these kids that it's created this gigantic monster hydra that goes into so many different fields. It goes into the psychological field, goes into the medical field, it goes into Medicaid and Medicare fraud because they also kidnap elderly people. As I don't know if any of you saw the updates from Terry LaPointe recently this week. They still have this elderly grandmother, retired school teacher in hospice, and they're killing her. And it's like no vulnerable person is safe from these institutions if we do not continue to fight and change these laws. And I was just talking to Rachel a little bit earlier about the reason we do this show is because we want to create a vehicle that if you're engaged in this battle or you have a loved one or a friend or someone you care about that has had their children or an elderly person or a disabled relative or friend kidnapped by these people. When we were going through this, we didn't have a lot of resources. There was not a lot of information, not a lot of groups. And over the past few years, we've seen this magnificent explosion all across this country. We've seen legislation pass that they're trying to resist, but it's happening, guys. It's happening. And I know when you're in the battle and you're the one suffering, the bigger picture sometimes is harder to see. And I just want to encourage you, don't give up. And I want to remind everybody, I don't read this every show, but I'm going to read it one more time, and then we're gonna bring Rachel up. We're gonna talk to her about what happened in her case. But we call this show "We Hold These Truths" because I think all of these issues come around to what we believe about this country and about our protected rights and about inalienable rights, meaning they cannot be taken from us. A government can try, but they'll be wrong. And one of those is the right to care and control of our children. But the whole show is based on this. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women, back then men mean women and men, don't freak out and be triggered by that, but all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator, another trigger word, but we need to understand this. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. that there's two things we got to take from this. Like, I don't understand if you're somebody that doesn't believe in a creator, or you come from an atheistic standpoint. I'm not demonizing you. I'm just saying I don't know where you get the concept yourself of unalienable rights. But from the Constitution, from the Bill of Rights, these are rights that are inherent in us, in our creation, when we come into this world, that we possess by nature of creation, that cannot be taken from us. And that's why this battle is so important. Because another thing that the people that penned this document understood is that it's always a battle. That in this world, people are corrupt, and they're going to try to come against those liberties. They're going to try to enslave people. You give someone power, you got to have checks on that power. And so that's why these shows are important. That's why it's important for you to continue to fight your case and to network with people and get information. Okay, that's my soapbox for the evening. I just think it's important. I see so much going on in this country right now that I feel we are very close to losing the centrality that our rights are inherent and that they can't be taken from us. And we are really on the cusp of something. And part of that corruption that we're seeing, I used to tell people that having certain political groups rule this country would be like an entire country run by DCF. And that's terrifying. But there's really countries out there run like DCF, where you get into court and they lie about you and they manipulate the legal process and they threaten you and they take people out that are causing too many waves. And we don't want our country to become like that. Rachel Bruno and her family are ones that engaged in that battle and they won. So I'm going to read you a little bio from rachelbruno.com. If you want to learn more about Rachel, if you want to get in contact with her, see some of the other work that she's done, interviews, you go to rachelbruno.com. And it says, Rachel Bruno is a wife and a mother of 2 young boys. She holds a bachelor's degree in communication from California State University at Long Beach and completed an MBA from Pepperdine University with the hopes of starting her own business. And then everything was going according to plan, and her kids were taken. And made Rachel reconsider her priorities. And today she's a stay-at-home mom who works part-time leading a group of young mothers called Moms Inc. at her church. She's in Orange County, California, I believe. Or if that's wrong, she's shaking her head yes. Okay, Orange County, California. And she leads group discussions and Bible studies while curating speakers she knows will be relevant and beneficial to the mom's individual walk with Christ. And this blog is her testimony. I didn't read anywhere in there that, she's addicted to crack or been arrested 20 times. So, Rachel, why don't you come on and share with us how you're doing this evening? Thank you for joining us.
Good. Thank you for having me on. Look forward
to
sharing.
Welcome. Well, it's pretty interesting bio, and I think that from the beginning, it's important for people to get your introduction, what I'd say your red pilling, to the fact that in this system, we don't have constitutional rights. Why don't you share people a little more about yourself and what started the DCF attack upon your life and your family?
Okay, so like you said, I've never been arrested for drugs. I've never anything in my life. The worst thing I've ever done is a speeding ticket. And I did grow up in church my whole life, and you were reading that part of our Constitution. I came here from Brazil after my father passed away when I was 9 months old. So my mom was a widow and a single mother. And this country, took us in. The church took us in. They sponsored us. They took care of us. And I love this country, and that Constitution, I learned that from the moment, 3 years old in this country. And I never in a million years would have suspected that something like DCSF is happening in this country. And it completely, opened my eyes, took me by shock. It was disappointing. It was heartbreaking to realize that this was going on in this country. And a little background about me, I've had seizures since I was about 5 years old. And one of the main triggers for my seizures is sleep deprivation or interrupted sleep.
Oh, wow.
And if you're a mom out there, you ain't sleeping. So with my firstborn, I had my mother-in-law come from Brazil and my mom. They helped me with my firstborn. And second time around, they both told me, you know what, we're too old for this. So here's the money that we've conjured up together. Why don't you go get yourself a nanny? I'm like, awesome. You guys are the best moms ever.
Sure. Yeah.
So, I started the interview process. I contacted agencies and I found this person who apparently, was new to this industry, but she had two kids herself. Her husband was a Marine and she was referred, she volunteered at her church at the time. So I interviewed her. I asked her, would she be willing to watch my newborn son for the night shift so that I could sleep. So she watched him from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. And she started when he was about 7 days old. Everything was going well until he was about 7 weeks old. I woke up to him screaming at about 4 o'clock in the morning. And this was back in July of 2015. And I looked at my clock, it said 4:06. I'm like, okay, diaper change, bottle, that was usually the regular time. And he was screaming, then he stopped. And I'm like, okay, so I tried to put myself back to sleep. A few minutes later, he starts screaming again. Then he stops, then he starts, then he stops. This went on for about half an hour till I finally got up and I walked, down the hallway. She had the door partially opened. She had him swaddled inside the crib and he was lying on his back. And she was sort of rocking him back and forth and shushing him, trying to get him to calm down. And that wasn't working. So she picked him up, put him like in a birth position on her shoulder, and the screaming stopped. But he was making these facial expressions and he was just not happy. And when she put him on the shoulders, when she kind of turned around and she saw that I was there, and I asked her, what happened? And she said, I just fed him and he's really gassy. I said, okay, fair enough. Newborns get really gassy and they do scream like crazy when they're gassy. And at this point, I'm home alone. My husband is on a business trip out of state. And my older son, David, was sleeping across the hallway. So last thing I wanted to do was wake up my son at 4 o'clock in the morning. So I told her, he's obviously not settling down. I'll take the baby and you can go home. So that was it. She went home, packed her stuff, and I unswaddled my son. No rashes, no signs of anything really. And I gave him skin to skin and he calmed down. I'm like, okay, you just wanted your mommy. You needed that skin to skin. And I dozed off till I woke up again with him screaming at about 7 o'clock. And at 7, I figured, okay, you're hungry, right? Last feeding was at 4. So I tried to nurse him and he refused. So I'm still kind of jaded, with gassiness in my head. I'm like, okay, maybe you're still colicky. Don't want to nurse right now. Okay. So I re-swaddle him. And at that point, my 20-month-old son, David, wakes up. So he's screaming out for me. So I go get him and I try to put the baby down. And anytime I would lay him down flat, he would just scream. And if I picked him up, he was fine. So I'm like, okay, you just want to be held. So I'm holding him, picking him up with one arm, picking the other one up with the other arm and trying to go on with my morning. So long story short, after about 6 hours of my baby, Lucas, not nursing, not napping, not being able to put him down, and I'm still Googling nursing strike, colic. I'm like, what is wrong with this kid? I have no idea what's wrong with this kid. I call my mom, who was with her husband, who was having cataract surgery that day. I'm like, Mom, please, can you come over so that I can call the pediatrician? So she came over. I called the pediatrician. I tell the receptionist, what the symptoms are. And she said, the doctor isn't available until 3 o'clock that afternoon. I said, no, my son's been screaming since 4 o'clock in the morning. He's not eating. I need to see somebody. And then she's like, okay, then take him to the emergency room. So I did with my mom, along with my older son. And on our drive to the hospital, Lucas fell asleep, what we thought he was falling asleep in the car. He stopped crying, arrive at the emergency room, and I tell the symptoms. They take me in, blood pressure fine, no temperature, nothing alarming. And here I'm thinking, okay, now the doctor is going to think I'm crazy, right? This overreacting mom, the baby's fine.
Right, I've been there.
Yeah, so I go into the room and he tells me to lay him down on the bed. And then he walks away, or he looks like he's walking away. And I'm like, yeah, great. No, he's probably going to tell me to give the kid Benadryl or something. But he stops just short at the doorway and he turns around and he's just looking down at my son on that bed, like laser focused on my son. And the whole room is silent. I'm like, okay, this is weird. And he's looking at my son. And then he starts walking towards my son and he goes straight to his ear, behind his left ear. And he touches it. He's like, did you feel this? I said, no. So he grabs my hand, makes me touch it. Like, you feel that bulge there? I said, yeah. Like, that's fluid that's leaking from your son's brain.
Oh, wow. That must have been a horrible moment.
I'm like, what does that mean? And he's like, well, it could be spinal cerebral fluid or it can be blood. The brain hates blood. So we need to go do a CT scan right now and see what's going on. So at that point, I'm on the bed, I'm holding him. They roll up the rails, and there's like 10 people who rush into that room. I mean, they're already intubating him, they're putting stuff on him, and I'm just holding him. I have no idea what the heck is going on. And they start running down the hallway to the CT room, and my son's right arm starts to twitch as they're going down the hallway. And that one, then they push that thing, they start running. And that's when I had like a little light bulb moment. I'm like, oh, left side of the brain, right arm twitching, he's having a seizure, right? I have seizures. And I'm like, oh my God, it's genetic, right? I must have passed this on to my son. And I said a little prayer right then and there. I'm like, God, please spare my son. Have mercy on my son from having to live with this disease like I have my whole life. And just that little prayer, enough time to get to the room. And they said they'll call me back with the results. I go back to my mom, I tell her what's going on, and we're texting our families in Brazil. I'm texting my husband what's going on. The doctor comes back, he's like, Mrs. Bruno, this is very serious. And I'm like, okay. So he takes me to the back room where all the computers are. He shows me the image. He's like, the fluid that's leaking is blood. And it's a cranial fracture with an intracerebral blood hemorrhage. And I still processing this. Like at that point in time, like the word fracture didn't really register with me.
Sure.
He's a newborn. I'm thinking, the cranium isn't completely formed yet. Like, did one of those flaps pop open? Is the blood due to an aneurysm? I'm thinking a million different things. Never did I think that this was what was later found out to be a non-accidental blunt force trauma. So the doctor said we have to take him to emergency surgery right now. We're going to drain the blood and try to fix the fracture. So I'm signing all the paperwork, and off they go with my 7-week-old son. And I'm there with my mom, and we're just praying, trying to hold ourselves together. I'm texting my husband and just waiting at the hospital about 3 hours. Surgery took about 3 hours, and the surgeon comes back. He's like, okay, the surgery went well. Clinically speaking, we were able to drain all the blood, and we fixed the fracture with the sugar plate. And I'm like, is he going to be okay? Like, does he have brain damage? And the doctor said, honestly, we don't know. He's too young, right, due to his age. And we don't even know whether he's going to survive the next 48 hours. I'm like, okay.
Wow.
So he's like, we have him in a medically induced coma right now because he started having seizures after the surgery. That's probably due to the contact with the blood. So he's in the PICU, took me up there, and there's my baby, gauze wrapped all around his head, tubes coming out everywhere, and just seemingly lifeless. And I'm there with my mom.
Not to interrupt, but just to get a narrative of the DCF portion of when they came in now. Obviously, you're in shock. You're dealing with this, probably not even thinking in your mind, here comes the people to attack my life. Were they questioning you at that time? Were they treating you suspiciously? Were they, or were they just trying to stabilize the baby? At what point did all of a sudden you turn into a suspect? I mean, when did the DCF show up?
I never felt any judgment from the doctors, to be honest. The doctors were very cool with me. And it wasn't until the police and a social worker showed up at the door. And, they knocked at the bedroom door, like, Mrs. Bruno, can we speak to you? And of course, I thought it was weird. What the heck is a police officer doing in the hospital, and why do they want to talk to me? But the first words out of their mouth is, we're here to help you. Right? We're here to help you figure out what happened.
That's what they always say. We're just here to help with 6 police officers.
Right. So my mind immediately goes to the nanny, right? It's obvious to me what happened that day. Now, whether she did it on purpose or maliciously, that I don't know. And to this day, I still don't know. I'm not going to accuse her. I'm not going to do it. And that's probably what got me in trouble to begin with, is that, they told me what happened to your son is criminal. And it was worse than getting shot in the head with a bullet.
Oh, wow.
So they're telling me these things. I'm thinking, they're referring to the nanny. Right? So they're like, will you speak to us? Will you help us help you? And I'm like, of course. So they sit down there at the hospital with me. I tell them the whole saga starting at 4 o'clock in the morning. And the police officer starts asking me, why did it take you so long to bring him to the hospital? Because I didn't know what was wrong with my son. She told me he was gassy. Like, why didn't you call 911? I'm like, again, I didn't know what was wrong with my son. Gassiness is not an emergency where I would call 911.
Sure.
And he's like, why did you bring him to a hospital in Orange County when you live in LA County? Which at that time, I did live in LA County. It's about a 20-minute drive. And I'm like, because this is the children's hospital that I know. I wanted to bring him to Children's Hospital. So he's just jotting down notes. Then the social worker asked me things. And she's like, do you have any other children? I said, I do. Like, where is he right now? He's with my mom, sleeping at my mom's house. Like, would you mind if we go and take a look at him? I thought, okay, he's probably sleeping by now. And she's like, we're not going to wake him. We just want to make sure he's okay. So again, in my mind, nothing to hide, right? So why not cooperate, right? They always tell you to cooperate with law enforcement and cooperate. I did. So they asked me where my husband was. Told them my husband was out of town. He was on his way that day back. And they asked what time. I told them the time. I showed them the itineraries. I mean, I gave them all the information I had possible. So shortly after the social worker leaves, saying that she's going to go check on my son, this was probably about 9:30 at night, the police officer asked me if I'll wait for the detectives, that the detectives are on their way and they would like to speak to me as well. So again, I comply, I wait. When my husband shows up, he comes straight from the airport to the hospital. And then the police officer takes my husband to another room and makes me wait in another room. So hindsight is 2020. Now I'm seeing, what's going on. But back then I didn't connect the dots. So I asked my husband what was happening, asked me what was happening. The detectives didn't show up till probably about 11:30 at night. And they interviewed me till about 2 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, wow.
So I'd been up 4 o'clock that morning till 2 o'clock that morning, or the next morning.
And a lot of people don't realize, until like you that get in that situation. In their mind, they're thinking, I know I've done nothing wrong. I care about my child. These people have a role to assist and to help, and I want to assist them to do their job. If at that point in time you would have lawyered up really quick, they would have used that against you of, well, what are you trying to hide? And you're just, moving right along, giving them all the points of facts, and then at some point in time, it shifts. How did that shift? What did that look like?
So I went to sleep at 2 a.m. after I was done with the detectives. I told them, I definitely don't want to have a seizure now. So I need to go sleep. I've been up since 4 o'clock in the morning. We can continue this later, if you want to. At that point, my husband already knew, but he didn't tell me because he knew I had already been under a lot of stress that day. So he told me to go to sleep. But the social worker showed up at my mom's house at 2 o'clock in the morning with the police officers and told my mom, we're taking my son, David, we're taking him.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And my mom is like, no, you're not. And the social worker said, well, if you don't give him to us, we're going to arrest you. Okay, so my mom, again, not knowing our rights, not knowing what the heck is going on. The police officer is standing right there, knowing full well that my mom has not committed any crime, that they did not have a warrant, they did not have a court order, they had absolutely nothing. But they stand there armed on their walkie-talkies, saying they're calling for backup, saying that if you don't give him to us, then my mom's like, okay, if I go to jail, can I take him with me? And the social worker's like, no, you're going to have a criminal record and you're not going to be able to care for your grandson. He's going to go to foster care. My dad is calling lawyers at 2 o'clock in the morning. My son is awake. Now he starts crying. He's noticing something is going on. And my mom just didn't know what to do. At that point, my mom decided to cooperate and gave my son to the social worker, strapped him in the car, and off they drove into the night, not telling us where they were taking him, what was going on, gave my mom the business card, and that was it. And my husband was on the phone with my mom at that point, crying with the social worker, pleading, what are you doing? What are you doing to my son? This is not what you told my wife you were going to do. You were lying. And we had no power. Like, there was nothing we can do. So they took my son, and I wake up the next morning at about 10 o'clock in the morning. And my husband already knows what was going on, but he's just staring at me, this blank look on his eyes. And my first instinct is to look at the baby. He's well, he's stable, he's alive. What's going on? And then that's when he tells me they took David. And I said, what do you mean they took David? Where? Who? She's like, and then he tells me the whole thing, the social worker. And I'm like, she lied to me. Like she told me she was going to look at him and that it was okay. What the heck? Where? So we're scrambling, right? Trying to find a lawyer. The social worker was not returning our phone calls. The supervisor wouldn't return our phone calls. We had no idea where our son was. So I finally got in touch with a lawyer, a family court dependency lawyer. Now, I did not go the public defender route. I got a private attorney, and he talked to me that afternoon. And I go in there, I'm laughing. I'm like, this is some sort of joke, right? Like, where is my son and when can I get him? Like, this is some form of miscommunication. And he's like, sitting me down, you have no idea what you're in for. This is not a joke. And I'm like, I didn't do this. And he's like, oh, I believe you, but it doesn't matter. I'm like, what do you mean it doesn't matter? What happened to the Constitution? I asked him, like, what happened to innocent until proven guilty? And he's like, not in family court. They don't follow constitutional law. And I'm like, but that's the law of the land, isn't it? And he's like, not in family court. They have their own parallel law.
And
So
see, that I don't mean to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
People need to understand this, that even the attorneys know what's going on. And a lot of people say, well, why won't these attorneys cooperate? Why can't we get anyone to help? They understand how big of a beast it is they're tackling. And attorneys are still people like everybody else. As much as we'd like to think every person operates under this strict constitutional principle of life, they have careers, they have families. They're not going to throw their lives away for one person or one case a lot of times. Not saying that's right, but you have an attorney admit to you, say, well, the Constitution doesn't exist here, but that's not the case. It's how they operate,
Right.
but it's not how they're supposed to operate.
Right.
And because they are under all this secrecy, they get away with it. And is why we continue to need to expose it. So you get this attorney, he's telling you, you're in for a ride. I believe you, but you're about to get an education on how corrupt a family court is. So did they have any emergency hearing after that?
They did. So
where did your sons end up getting placed?
72 hours later, we had the hearing. So in that initial meeting with my lawyer, he said, they're not giving your kids back to you. And again, I'm like, I didn't do this. He's like, doesn't matter. Your saving grace is that your husband was out of town when this happened. So legally speaking, he wasn't even at the crime scene. Okay, if I go in there and I try to fight for you to get your children back to you, they're not going to give your kids back to you. Like, the one thing I would suggest, or I strongly advise you, that we give sole custody to your husband so that they don't even get placed in foster care. Because if they get placed in foster care and the case lasts longer than 6 months, they can be legally adopted by the foster family.
Now, they didn't charge you with a criminal charge at this time, correct?
No.
Did they charge you a criminal charge anytime during these proceedings?
No.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you would have went to criminal court, then you have a right to a jury. You have beyond a reasonable doubt as the evidentiary standard. I don't know what it is in Orange County, but in Kansas, where they took our kids, they've actually changed the evidentiary standard. So in criminal court, you have beyond a reasonable doubt. Then they used to be, what was it under ours? I want to say clear and convincing evidence. And now they go on a preponderance of evidence. So they just preponder, the evidence says, you did this. We don't have to prove anything. And here you are fighting out of this. You're not arrested. You're not charged with a crime. And yet they're saying, you are a criminal. We're keeping your kid from you unless you give up this child, which in a lot of these, it seems like you were really blessed and protected, because a lot of times they'll just try to dig something up on the husband and say, oh, this guy got a DUI 25 years ago. He's not fit to have this child in his custody. But you were fortunate, by the grace of God, your husband was out. They say you have to sign over full custody. Did they begin to put a bunch of conditions on you? Or are they forcing you to do psychological examinations? How did they, and what I would say, attack your life in an attempt to gaslight you and prove that you're the criminal that they think you are?
Well, at the hearing, so they said, we'll give sole custody to your husband. And everyone agreed except for social services. Social services actually objected to
Of
giving
course they
my
did.
children to my husband. And the judge asked them why. And they said, because we didn't get a chance to speak to the father. And that is true because law enforcement at the hospital told social worker to not interview my husband. So by the grace of God, again, another God miracle, the judge overruled. And the judge overruled and said they're going to their father. Mrs. Bruno, you have 24 hours to vacate your home, and your caseworker will
Wow.
be calling you with a safety plan, right, for your kids and hopefully reunification.
So fortunately, they gave it to your husband, but they kick you out of
Yes.
your own house when you're not convicted of a crime. You're not even charged with a crime.
Yeah.
It's just you're going to leave because that's one thing I've seen they like to do. They like to split up spouses. Their ideal condition is if they can get two hostile spouses, because then they can get one spouse that's the most toxic against the other one that's fighting against them, and they'll give custody to the bad spouse a lot of times. Fortunately, you guys seem to have had it together at that time.
Yes.
But just the thought that, most families, they can't afford two households. They tried to do the same to my wife, where they were like, basically, well, you have to go to a homeless shelter. She had already moved out of the state when they took our kids when we were in transit, and they were like, you have to come back to Kansas and live in a homeless shelter. And we were like, absolutely not. But then they use that against you as well. Anything they can utilize to demonize you or make your life difficult, they'll do.
Yeah.
So
So
fortunately, you had some support,
yeah.
but not everybody gets that opportunity. So they give you a safety plan. What did that look like?
So I was court ordered to take child abuse classes, parenting
If,
classes, and
wow.
individual counseling.
So you, in their mind, were a child abuser, and
Yeah,
you took this class.
I did. I signed
Was
up
it
for everything.
was it geared towards convincing you that you abused your child? Did they treat you as if you were guilty during this?
Not really. I think the
Okay,
place
that's
that
good.
I went to, everybody, just like my lawyer, knew what the system was. And they weren't surprised at all by my story. And they weren't surprised who the child abuse expert at the hospital was that turned me in, what the hospital was, what they weren't surprised at all. So
And
they
why weren't they surprised? So who was this expert, and why weren't they surprised about the hospital?
Well, she is the quote unquote child abuse expert at the hospital, right at this children's hospital in Orange County. She has been sued, I believe, 8 times before
Oh wow.
for falsifying information in these child abuse cases. And yet she still works there, still holds her
And still
job.
has a medical license,
Yeah.
and wow.
Yes. So, I mean, in Orange County, I guess, if you're part of this community and you work within the system, they all know each other. And even my attorney at the time, he said, did you speak to Dr. Wong? And at the time, I didn't know who she was. And I said, I did. And he's like, you do not speak to that woman. Okay. You let her come in. You do not say a word to that woman. And I'm like, okay. Okay. And he told me the whole time, he's like, nobody here is your friend. Nobody is your friend. The only person who's your friend here is me. And that's only because you paid me. So, I mean, he was
That's
really
pretty incredible. And so, in your experience, I don't know how much contact you've had with other parents. I know you've been pretty active in the community of people just trying to educate about DCF. Have you seen it a common thing that they take these expert witnesses to demonize family, or was your case an exception?
my case was definitely an exception. I mean, my case is a fairy tale in comparison to other stories that I've heard. I mean, I definitely had God's protection, and not to say that, if you're going through this, that you don't have God's protection. But I mean, I really have no other explanation than God was just shielding me because I'm one of the lucky ones. And I know I'm one of the lucky ones.
And so, how long did you have to endure this? Did you have to go through like a larger court hearing where they determined whether or not they were going to keep your child in care for longer? And just to back up a little, if people don't know this, if this is your first time watching the show, the real reason the social workers objected is because under Title IV, now that's changing under the Families First Act,
right.
but under the Adoption and Safe Families Act, DCF does not get the same kind of funding when the child goes to kin.
Yeah.
It's called a kinship placement where I'm from. And so if they stay with family, all those extra incentives that they get, all that big money, they do not get 99% of the time. They'll find other ways to try to manipulate that system. So obviously they're going to object. Fortunately, it seems like you had a judge that was paying attention to the law, which is also an exception from what I've seen.
Right.
So did you have another hearing? How did that go? How did the case progress?
Yeah. So just to go back to that money thing, when they took my son at 2:00 in the morning, they took him to the county's children's shelter.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't get to see my son for 2 days, right? They wouldn't release him to us because I guess we were criminals now, as you say, right? We were under investigation. They released him to my mom because she was a public school teacher. And thankfully she was fingerprinted. She was in the system. She had all that stuff. So when she brought him home, the social worker asked my mom if she would adopt my son before I had a hearing, before a judge ever heard the case, before anything.
Wow.
Right? They asked my
Do you
mom
know why? Do you have an idea of why they would have tried to initiate that so quickly?
because the social worker said, we don't know what's going to happen at the hearing on Monday. So if the judge orders the child be removed, would you be willing to adopt them? And my mom nearly fell off her seat. She's like, no, give them back to their mom, to who they belong. And the social worker's like, no.
See, that's...
You'll get $670 a month per child. You will be eligible for WIC. You'll be eligible for the food stamps. And my mom's like, I don't want your money. And the social worker, well, this is what we help you with. You qualify. And my mom told her, can I save it for the lawyers? Can I save the checks to pay the lawyers? So the social worker just smiled and said, I'll pretend I didn't hear that. But
And so did they disqualify your mom? Did they say, because when I hear, trust me, I'm a little jaded, but when they're asking something like that, I see that as a manipulation tactic. Let's scare this grandma. Let's overwhelm her. So when we go back into court, we can say, well, family doesn't want placement. That's what I would see them doing.
Well,
But
my mom ultimately did sign the papers.
That's good.
She did sign the
good.
papers, and me and my mom, I'm like, I know my mom, even if it's on paper, it's still my child, my mom would never prevent me from seeing my children.
Sure.
So, I was fine with that. I'm like, whatever's on paper, I don't care, as long as I get to see my children. So she did sign the papers. And I believe that if they have the papers, even though the children were given to their father, they can still claim that, grandma signed these papers and that these children are technically in the system.
Yeah, they find ways to manipulate. It's just harder. And sometimes they'll just commit outright fraud. What I discovered when I was researching, so we called the ombudsman. I can never pronounce that word.
Right.
But they're the ones that are supposed to oversee that the states are complying with the federal regulations in order to get the federal incentives. And so when I was asking her, how do they break this down? Like, can I find out how much money they've gotten from my children being in care and all the fake things they've been doing to them? And she was like, no, it just comes in lump numbers. So what they'll show is 800 kids are in care. 500 of those kids are considered special needs. 300 of those kids have IEPs at school. So it's really structured for fraud. They could have put you in there not as a kinship placement, but just as another block payment, and then they get block payments every quarter that basically on these fraudulent numbers that they give to the federal government. And so I wouldn't be surprised if they collected money on your case for sure. And so your mom gets the kids, it ends up getting in your husband's care. How much longer and what kind of occurred before you actually got your children back?
Okay, so we had a bunch of hearings in between, right, where you basically just show up and you give them a progress report about the child abuse classes, the parenting classes, and, you go in there for like 10 minutes and the judge, orders you out. Okay, keep doing what you're doing, basically. I never once got to say a word in that court, ever. Never heard my side of the story, never got to defend myself. They never mentioned the nanny, nothing. It was all about me.
Because they keep that stuff off the record. That way, if they would have terminated down the road, you can't reintroduce that there was a nanny there if it's not in the record, because the Court of Appeals aren't looking at new evidence. It's very slick how they do that. Sorry to interrupt.
So interestingly enough, on the 40th day, It was 40 days and 40 nights. On the 40th day, I had a hearing. And my attorney said, don't even bother coming to court today. The criminal investigation is still open. The status of your case hasn't changed. So, don't waste your time. I won't waste mine. So, at that point, he'd been right about everything else. So I told my husband, I'm like, he told me not to go. And my husband's like, I don't care what he says, we're going. So we go to the courthouse and we wait for about an hour and a half. And I get a phone call from my lawyer. He's like, where are you? I'm at the courthouse. He's like, okay, I'm on my way. Might be able to do something today. Then hangs up on me. Again, at that point, I start texting everybody, start my family. I'm like, everybody start praying. I don't know what's going to happen. Something's going to happen. So he walks in, I go hug him, and he pushes me away. He's like, don't hug me yet. I can't make you any promises. So he goes into the courtroom. About an hour later, he comes back. He's like, a bunch of stack of papers, sign this, initial this, do this, do this. And at this point, I'm just trusting God and the lawyer. I have no idea. I'm not reading anything. I don't know what the heck I'm signing. And I'm in the spirit, right? So he goes in and out, in and out, in and out. About 3 hours later, he comes back with a stack of papers. He's like, okay, if you agree to everything that's written in this report, there is no admission of guilt. There's nothing in here that says you did this. This is just basically the timeline of the investigation, your progress on the services, what they ordered you to do, the medical history, what they did to your son, all that stuff. If you sign this today, they will let you go home today. So at that point, if they told me to cut off my leg, I would have cut off my leg, right? Just to be home with my children. And I signed it, and my lawyer told me, he's like, I've been doing this for 23 years, and I have never seen them let anybody go home. Like, you definitely have a higher power working for you.
That's crazy admission, though.
Yes.
I've been doing this for 23 years, and I've never seen this happen.
Right.
That's crazy.
Yep. So I signed the papers, and I went home that day. They put us on what they call family maintenance plan, where the social worker comes to our house once a month. I was still court ordered to take the child abuse, the parenting, the individual counseling. The criminal case was still open, but they allowed me to move back in with my children. So prior to that, I was given 7 hours monitored visitation a week with both my sons.
Just once a week, or 7 hours through the week?
7 hours through the week. So I can make up my mind, whether I wanted it to be one day for 7 hours, or I chose to do it like every other day because it was like torture, to see my son for 1 hour a day. And again, they tell you can't talk about the case with your son. You can't tell your son why this is happening. You can't explain to him when you're going home. You can't say anything. And at this point, he's almost 2 years old. I mean, he ran away from me when I first saw him.
Because they can tell him stuff, and as soon as they take the children away, they can say whatever they want, but you can't counter their false narrative, or they'll terminate the visit. That's how they manipulate and control parents. It's insane.
So, I mean, it was heartbreaking. It was heart-wrenching to see my son and have to leave. I wouldn't cry. And in the beginning, he would cry when I would leave. Then after a while, he didn't cry because he was getting used to it, which was even more heartbreaking for me. I'm like, my poor kid, what are you doing to my son? I'm like, I don't care what you do to me. I'm an adult. But why are you doing this to this innocent child?
At a critical developmental age, where even recently they're showing, these short-term or long-term separations actually can cause developmental issues and problems down the road. And who knows, especially when the mom is such an important element to that dynamic. Not saying dads aren't, but in the early development of a child, I truly believe that moms play a very critical role dads can't.
Yeah. So they allowed me to move back home. So the case lasted for another 6 months, where the social worker came to our house every month. And at the end of those 6 months, this social worker recommended that our case be closed. So 6 months later, we go to the courthouse, and we don't even walk into the courtroom. Once again, they just come out, Bruno family, like here, and they're like, okay, sign this, case is closed. And that's it.
That's honestly pretty amazing. From most of the stories that we hear, definitely I believe that you had some divine intervention. Now, during that process, did you see social workers trying to falsify information? Did you have them continuing to try to get you to admit guilt? Was there any of that going on, or were they kind of keeping away from all of that?
Yeah, I mean, not falsify information per se, but they did write in the court reports that I wasn't emotional enough, that I wasn't exhibiting the normal signs of a grieving mother, that I didn't seem concerned for my baby Lucas. I was more concerned about David. And I'm like, yeah, because David actually understands what's going on, right? And my son
Right.
Lucas was in the hospital in a medically induced coma. I'm praying for my son that he lives. And they asked me if I had postpartum depression over and over and over to try to pin that on me. And I didn't have postpartum depression, thank God. But even if I did, ripping a woman's child away is not going to to help that.
Oh, that might trigger it. Some of that.
Right.
I mean, crazy.
But they were trying to get me to admit to those things or to say, maybe I did, and I had really good counsel with my lawyer. I also had a private investigator to try to see if he could find anything about the nanny. And there weren't any red flags about the nanny, except for the fact that she was married to a cop. And she didn't tell me that at the time. She said he was stationed in the Marines, which he was, but he was also in the police academy. So, my private investigator, who was ex-FBI and who was in the DEA, as soon as he found that out, he told me, he's like, they're not going to go after her.
No, they're going to protect that
Right.
whole situation. And so then they close your case. And what made you decide to litigate, or what? How did that process play out?
Yeah. Well, during those 40 days, that I was kicked out of the house, like I couldn't see my husband, I couldn't see my kids, I was out of my house. I lived in the hospital while my son was in the hospital. Then my pastor's wife, my mom went to ask her to go pray for me and to pray for my son who was in the hospital. And she did. She came over to the hospital and then she looked at me and she's like, I've been praying and God told me you're coming home with me. So I went to go live with the pastor and his wife. He was out of state at the time. He was out of the country. So it was just me and her. And just during those 40 days, it was really a lot of reflection. Those times alone at night. I mean, you're really alone. You're used to the noise of the kids crying. You're used to your routine. You're used to talking to your husband. And I had no one but God. Right.
So you were even restricted from talking to your husband at that
Well,
time?
just because he was with home with the kids. Right. And I
Okay.
couldn't leave the kids with anybody. So I had the fire inside me. I'm like, this is crazy. And I'm like, God, what the heck is this? Like, who sinned? Right. Like, why is this happening? And it was revealed to me. I mean, I believe it. The Holy Spirit spoke to me that night and he said, this is just the evil world we live in. Right? It's just evil. And it's the destruction of the family. And the more I heard about the cases, the more I was in that child abuse class and I heard other people's stories. I'm like, yeah, this totally makes sense. This is evil. Right? It's like it's a system of good versus evil. And I know that God didn't expose me to all of this in vain. And I know that he didn't give me victory in vain. And I know, everything that happened was not so that I would stay silent. So even though the case was closed, even though I got my kids back, I could have very well be happy. I got my kids back, move on with my life, but something inside me just wouldn't let me. And I'm like, this people need to know about this, especially starting with the church. I grew up in church.
Especially starting with the church.
And foster care was like, the Make-A-Wish Foundation, right? You make backpacks for the kids, you donate, you pray, you become foster parents. There are workshops on how to become foster parents. And then I'm seeing all this madness going on. I'm like, oh my gosh, people really don't know what is going on. People don't know. And to this day, like I said, I don't blame the foster parents. They would have no way of vetting. I can only imagine what a social worker would tell a foster parent about me. Because
Sure.
they lie, right? It's proven that they lie. And she could have very well told the potential parent, this 7-week-old baby suffered a cranial fracture while at the care of his abusive mother. Will you help?
Absolutely.
Right? So of course, if somebody is going to say, yes, give me that baby and never let this woman near this baby again.
And they're going to be hostile towards you at that,
Right.
saying, which I can see, in how I've seen God work in my own life and other people's life. I think it's very interesting, the number 40 days.
Right.
And that's a repetitious number throughout the Bible.
Yep.
God speaks in very clear ways in a lot of different things. And that to me is very significant. But even in that, like even when we tell our story, we've had a hard background. We've had a hard marriage. I've struggled with addiction in the past. God has given me grace and recovery in those things, but it can always be utilized by evil people against me to manipulate people's opinion. You don't have that. And so I think it is very important for your story to be told, especially in the realms of the churches, to say, no, wait a minute, look, I'm not that parent. There was no reason for us to have to go through this process in the way that they did it, lying, bullying, taking the child without exigent circumstances or a warrant, just doing whatever they can. But fortunately, it backfired in them. So you decide I can't be silent. And then did you start reaching out to attorneys? How did you find your attorney?
So my dependency attorney, the one here in Orange County, knows Sean McMillan. Okay. So I asked him, and my attorney actually told me, you know what, you stop being greedy. That's what he told me.
You got your kid back. That should be enough.
Exactly. Right. And I'm like, really? You think this is about money? I'm like, there is no amount of money that these people could pay me to ever get back what I lost with my children.
Absolutely. Right? And they don't realize it. Yeah, it's about, you got to hit them where it hurts. And that's the only language they seem to understand, is that they're committing fraud for money. And when they're exposed financially through civil rights lawsuits, even if the litigation fails, it's important for parents to file and to do it and to fight them the best that they can, because as that evidence piles up, that's a court record that stays forever. As long as this is a country, you should be able to pull up at least some facts of the civil litigation. And so we're building a record against these institutions by showing that this is a common practice, the deprivation of civil liberties. And so you get Sean McMillan, and you guys initiate a lawsuit. How was that process? Was it challenging? Do you feel like they try to come after you, intimidate you? What was that experience like?
Yeah, so we filed in 2017. We filed a petition in 2017, May of 2017, and the jury trial was scheduled for June 4th of 2019. So wow. May of 2017, so they gave us almost 2 years for discovery, right? What they call discovery, that we can get all the documents and start researching and building our case. So, at the time I'm like, 2 years? Seriously? I'm gonna have to wait 2 years before we go to this?
You're like, I'm ready now. Yes. What's the deal?
So, but Sean is like, oh no, you wait, you'll see. There's a lot of stuff that we're gonna go through.
Sure.
So we started, getting all the files, and, the juvenile records, they don't give them to us and protected right until they're 18, unless you are suing them. Then we have to file a motion. When we got the records, everything was redacted. They gave us a file with like 700 pages redacted.
And how did they justify that?
Because to protect the children, right? To protect the minors' rights, to protect whoever third parties are there. But Sean knows better, so he made a motion to the judge. He's like, no, we need the unredacted versions. And the judge granted that. So we did get all the unredacted. And that's really when I saw, what they did to my son, what they did to David when they took him to the children's shelter. I had no idea that they had given him the 13 vaccinations without.
Oh, wow. That's incredible.
Without a warrant, without a judge's order, nothing, because he wasn't up to date. And again, we're not anti-vaxxers. He was vaccinated. We had just modified the schedule with his pediatrician. We were under the care of his pediatrician, but they don't care. They just gave him all these shots at once. They forced him through a full skeletal survey to see if there were any broken bones on him. And I don't know if you've ever seen or know what a skeletal survey is, but basically taking a picture, an image of every single bone in your body. So you have to sit still, right, and lay there while they're doing this. And imagine a 20-month-old who had just been ripped away from his home at 2:00 in the morning with a bunch of doctors and strangers with these weird machines trying to take your clothes off, and take these images of you.
After being stabbed with a bunch of toxic substances, no offense, people that are vaxxers, but I mean, yeah, you brutalize this kid with
they traumatized the heck out of him, right? I mean, this is supposed to be in the best interest of the child, to do all this stuff to him.
Sounds like a sci-fi horror story.
And they, again, no allegations of sexual abuse, but they did what they call an anal wink test on him, where, they basically probe the anus and see how it contracts. I mean, I'm like, what are these people doing? So,
that's the reason for the redacted. They didn't want you to know the crazy stuff they were putting your child through without even notifying you, which is, I believe, at least in Kansas, it's required by law. Unless
Yeah.
you've lost your parental rights, there has to be some interaction. Oh, we're doing this to your child. We're going to,
Yeah.
even if it's an investigation, they still have to notify the parents. And they do this stuff all the time in
Yeah.
secret. And
Yeah.
I'm sure if parents could get those files, a lot of them would be shocked.
Right, they do. And what they used, the same laws here in California, you're supposed to have either a court order or parental consent. You can't do all these medical examinations to a minor. But what they used in our case was an order from 2008. Okay, this happened in 2015. They had what they call a general order from 2008 signed by a judge, and that's what they presented at the hospital to do all these.
They presented a court order that was a pre-signed order.
Yes.
That had nothing to do with your case when it was signed.
Right.
Was it some kind of statute that allowed them to do that, or were they just acting however they wanted?
They're just acting however they want. I asked Sean about this. I'm like, what the heck? Why can't a doctor like check the date of when the court order is? And Sean is
No
like, well,
kidding.
technically, doctors aren't expected to be investigators.
Because they're not attorneys. How would they know?
Right.
That's how they exempt themselves. But you
Right.
know what? They're doctors.
Right.
They have a lot of education. I'm not an attorney too, but I can go, wait a minute, this was signed 10 years ago. What,
Well,
that's a lame excuse.
Again, redacted part that was in the juvenile record. They told the doctor that there was a suspicion that David had his head thrown against the wall.
Wow.
So not Lucas, not the baby who had the trauma, his older sibling. They told the doctor that there's a suspicion of abuse. The sibling is in the hospital suffering severe head trauma. We think the sibling was hit against the wall. So therefore, do all these medical exams.
That was their justification. And while they're doing that, they're charging insane amounts for this forensic investigation without your permission or authorization, which is part of the fraud.
Right.
It's how all of these engage children's hospitals, these doctors that have 18 cases where they all say the parents are guilty. This is common, people. This is not like an anomaly that just happened to Rachel. This is common all over this country. And unfortunately, as you see, even a parent can't get, without some kind of legal fight, information about what people did to her child.
Yeah.
And so you get all these. Is there anything else notable that you'd want to share that kind of outraged you or surprised you about the discovery process?
So just that we got text messages from the social worker and her supervisor the night that they interviewed me. And the social worker, after she spoke to the child abuse expert at the hospital, before speaking to me, she texts her supervisor and tells her, I'm at the hospital. There's a baby with a severe head trauma. I need to go check out the sibling. According to mom, he was with the nanny. And then the supervisor replies back, OMG, do you think it was the nanny? And the social worker replies back, no, think mom.
Think mom, because we have to get these federal incentives. We can't keep mom.
So that was shocking to me. I'm like, oh my gosh, like these people, what is wrong with you people? I still had an inkling of hope that this was somehow a miscommunication, right? That, something odd happened. Maybe somebody misspoke, I still had that hope in me. But when I saw the unredacted files and I saw these things through discovery, I'm like, I cried, like, why? Like, why would you do this to somebody, right? To a child, to a family? Why do these people have this kind of power to be able to do this?
And that is the real question. Now, imagine if you're a family, their job is to come in and actually help families in crisis. None of us are in denial that there are families in crisis, families that need help. It should be a last resort when they remove children. As a society, we should try to assist our neighbor, other parents, become better parents, keep the family unit intact, but they don't do that. So imagine if you have a family with even a little bit of dirt in your background, even a history that's very, very old. You know what I mean?
Yep.
They will manipulate. Yours was 800 pages. They'll manipulate any point of data whatsoever. And I can't think of any right now because I'm kind of tired today. But it's like they begin these investigative processes of like, going to your husband and saying, so when you hit your husband or when you hit your wife, do you feel bad about it? Asking loaded questions.
Right.
changing the dynamic of the conversation to make somebody look guilty. It's
Right.
pretty incredible. You guys were fortunate not to have, this lengthy history that they could attack you on if
Right.
you would have had postpartum depression,
Right.
and that was documented somewhere.
Yep.
Sure wouldn't have been 40 days. That 40 days, they were digging, and they got to a point where they realized, I don't think, the kid's already with dad. I don't think we're going to find anything on these parents. Case closed, because they're not going to give up their whole child trafficking scheme
Right.
over one family, even if they really want your kid. And I'm not saying that initially. I understand the concern. You have a kid with a fracture. No
Right.
person's going to go, oh, yeah, I did that.
Yeah.
They have to investigate. It's the lying, the dishonesty, the manipulation. They can't just be straight up
Right.
and follow the law. They have to go in and bully people, steal children, manipulate things, hurt
Like
the
coming
children,
back at the
vaccinate them
hospital,
without
right?
consent,
Nobody told me ever that this was a child abuse investigation. Nobody told
which
me.
they should have.
Right. And that, this quote unquote child abuse expert, she should have to identify herself as such, right? And that she's there advocating, for the child or for
Well,
the
that she's
system.
conducting an
An
investigation,
Yeah.
and she needs to ask you some questions.
Right.
Do you want an attorney? Do
Yeah.
we're going to
Yeah.
protect your rights, but we need answers.
Right.
But they don't do that. You're
Yep.
automatically guilty. And how can we keep this child away from this parent?
Yeah.
So you go through the discovery.
Yeah, we find out that they spoke to the nanny one time. They spoke to her the day after, and that her daughter.
Who was they? Was it the police or
It was
social
the police and
services?
social services.
Okay.
So social services went to go see her, and her daughter had a bruise under her eye. Now, not to say that means anything, right? But since they're so hypersensitive about this, like that didn't set off any suspicions. And they asked her, why does your daughter have a bruise? Like she fell off the bed when she was sleeping. And, Sean McMillan questioned the social worker and questioned the detectives at the depositions. You're like, so, you assume that Rachel did this to the baby. And if the nanny is a perpetrator, a suspect, the mom is also a suspect. Why didn't you have the same, kind of harshness with the nanny that you did with the
equal treatment? Because they don't know. You both had
Right.
contact with
Yeah.
this child.
Yep. So they're like, well, because the nanny had a reasonable explanation of what happened to her child, whereas Mrs. Bruno did not have a reasonable explanation. And Sean was
Mrs.
like,
Bruno, I
sleeping.
was not there.
Yeah.
I was asleep. How is that not what? What are they
Right.
supposed to say?
And they're like, how do you prove a negative, right? How do I prove that I wasn't there if I wasn't there? So he did, get all that information. She did take a lie detector test at the time. She agreed to take one, and it came back inconclusive.
See, that's
Yeah.
crazy. I wouldn't take a lie detector test for anything. From everything I've seen, those things are dangerous to begin with. They're about 50% accurate,
Yeah.
and they can.
Well,
I've always been told if you did.
I did.
How did that go?
It came back. I did not lie. I needed a score of 6 or more to pass, and I got a 19.
Okay, so yours comes back straight up. She's telling the truth.
Right.
Hers comes back inconclusive, but you're still the center of the investigation.
Right. Yes. So, all this stuff coming out through discovery, I'm like, this is crazy. This is so crazy. So it made me want to fight even harder, of course, and then
Sure.
the depositions come, and the detective admitted that she's the one who ordered the social worker to remove the children.
Oh, wow.
So it was the detective, it was law enforcement, and Sean questioned her, did you get a warrant? No. Did you know you have to get a warrant? Yes. Why didn't you get a warrant? Because there was existential circumstances with the sibling, with the baby. Then Sean is like, the baby was in the hospital being cared for, correct? Yes. Did the child abuse expert ever indicate to you that mom was going to run away with the baby? No. Okay. And the other son was with his grandparents, correct? Correct. Was there any signs of abuse of him? No. So where is the exigent circumstance here? Right? Both kids were being cared for. And what about the father? Why didn't you give the kids to the father? The father wasn't even there when this happened. Why didn't you think about the father? And she says, well, we don't know. They could have been in cahoots together and made up this story. So they just really had made up their minds before they got there, literally. She had already ordered the children be removed before she got to the hospital to interview me. So
now, is there anywhere? I know with some families you can get, you can see these depositions. Are these all sealed? Is there anywhere people may be able to, just for their own, like I'm fighting my own legal
Yeah.
case. I'm representing myself. My wife is representing herself. It's very challenging if you
Mhm.
don't know how to navigate these shark waters. But I'm a nerd, but I like watching these depositions.
Yeah.
It kind of gives me insight in how the legal mind thinks. Is there
Right.
places people could look at these that you'd feel comfortable about, or?
Yeah, there are. I mean, there's over 36 hours worth of video.
Oh,
So
wow.
a lot of stuff. I have posted snippets of it on YouTube.
Okay.
And I believe if you go online, the Daily Caller article that they wrote
Daily
about
Caller.
me, yeah, there's an article on the Daily Caller. And
Ted,
there's,
if you could post that, please, if
yeah,
you're listening, I'd appreciate it. Okay, Daily Caller.
and there's another article on PJ Media by Megan Fox.
Yep, very familiar with Megan's work. She's a great warrior. I'm glad she's
Yeah.
out there doing this.
So in those articles, they
Okay,
have like two depositions in the articles, where one is with the
great.
worker and one is with the detectives. So yeah, they're out there.
And
And
so I'd encourage people, if just even to watch some of that and see, you can see the mentality of these workers and police officers. We have parts of our transcript when
Mhm.
they cross-examined the officer that took my kids, and they told her, did you go to the parents' house? No. Did you call their doctors for the kids? No. Did you call the schools? No. Did you send another agency to go to the parents' house? No. Did you do any investigation whatsoever? And she looked at us all and just smirked and said, nope.
Yeah.
And we were like, how? Oh, I lost my mic. There I go. Sorry, Rachel.
No
But we were
problem.
just thinking, okay, that right there should be the whodunit. They
Right.
just admit they took all of our kids, didn't do any investigation, put them into emergency temporary custody. They admitted the kids were fine. Uh, they weren't even in our care when they got taken into state custody. So they weren't asking about their placement where they were at. Are
Yeah.
these people abusing them? So they were already in a safe place while they were demonizing us. How could they take them into police custody? They do this all the time. They just have to determine, nah, we're going to take your kid.
Yeah.
And there's nothing you can do to stop them.
Yeah. It's true. So yeah, they admitted everything. I mean, I was shocked, when I was watching the depositions. I'm sitting there, across the table, trying to not jump across the table as they're
Take a
speaking.
lot of grace for sure. Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, because they're probably just saying it so emotionally, like, well, yeah, sure. So
No.
what? Yeah, we
Yeah.
break the law all the time. Who cares? What
Right.
are you going to do about it?
Yeah. And
That
what they
would be
kept saying
challenging.
over and over again is that mom should have known. Like that's one of the things that probably got to me, like emotionally. I would just start crying. Like, should I have known? Like, how should I have known? I'm not a doctor. I didn't know. You really think that I would let my son suffer for 6 hours, bleeding in his brain, and do this to my son? I'm like, what kind of person do you think I am?
And I've had 6 kids. Kids fuss, and they'll fuss for long periods of time, and you don't know what they're fussing
Right.
about. Sometimes it is gas. Sometimes it is like how to even say, well, the parents should just psychically know that
Right.
somebody or something happened where they weren't around.
Yeah.
That I mean, the pediatrician caught it, or the ER doctor, but he maybe had experience with those things. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, it
No, and
definitely
Sean
would be very challenging to.
taught the detective, this was funny during the depositions. I guess you're not allowed to ask personal questions, right? For this is only supposed to be legal based on the case. But the the detectives counsel, I think, was sort of in la la land when Sean was questioning her, and he asked her, "Do you have any kids?" And that's a personal question that I guess he shouldn't have asked, but he did. And the detective answered, "No." And then the attorney wakes up and she's like, "Objection." And Sean is like, "Too late, I already got my answer."
Right.
So then he begins to question her, like, "Okay, so have you ever taken care of a newborn?" And she says, "Yeah, for more than 2 hours." And she's like, "Maybe." Like, "Have you ever overnight taken care of a sick child?" He's like, "Ear infection, cold, sinuses, colic." And the detective is like, "No." And then Sean is like, "Well, I have. I have too." And yeah, kids can scream, kids can go for hours without eating, kids can do anything. And that does not mean the kid has a cranial fracture, right?
Right. I mean, I
So,
never would have thought, oh, my kid has a cranial fracture.
right, like who was going to think that? I never, ever, ever would have thought that.
Pretty horrifying. Well, we're running short on time, but
Yeah.
I did want to kind of conclude this a little with what happened in the end with this litigation, and then any advice or recommendations that you want to give to someone that may be watching this about that this is really happening. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? In terms of parents getting their children unjust taken, or advice you want to give to any parents. So, concluding the case, what was the end result? And
So we
do you have
settled.
any current?
Yeah, we settled in December of 2018. And, it was really hard for me specifically to settle. I told Sean, I'm like, I don't care if I win $1 at trial. I just want these people exposed and to be held accountable for what they did. And
Sure,
Sean is like, I understand, and your case definitely has merit. Not that you're going to lose in trial, but juries are a toss up, right?
sure.
And the social workers, police officers, detectives, doctors, these are all supposed to be the good guys in society, right? So it'd be really hard to convince a jury,
That
first of
they're
all,
lying.
that they're lying and to go over that barrier. And second
Right.
of all, again, they may not like the color of your hair. People are finicky. We don't know. Like juries are a toss up. Look at OJ Simpson's case, right?
Right.
So he's like, if they offer you, this amount of money, I would say, take it and run. Because even if we do go to trial, even if you do win, they're going to appeal it. Then we're back to square one. It's going to cost you another, a lot of money. And the emotional toll that it's going to take on you, the emotional toll that it's going to take on your family for the next 5 years, I would take this. I would settle. So we spoke with our pastors, we prayed about it, and ultimately decided that this was God giving us the opportunity to wipe the slate clean financially, because we were in a lot of debt due to all this, due to all the litigation and the fighting with the people. So it would allow us to pay off our bills. It would allow us to start saving for the kids, for the little college fund for them, or whatever else may come up in the future, who knows. And most importantly, it would give me the opportunity to close this chapter and do what I'm doing now, right? Because if I was still fighting, I would not be able to be doing it now.
Sorry about that.
No
Noisy kids in the house. No, you guys
problem.
are fine. Bringing in guinea pig army in here. My kids
Yeah.
love guinea pigs. They have a ton.
Noisy house is a
Yeah,
happy house.
and people, need to understand that the point is you won, and you've created a record that demonstrates that this pattern is happening. And the more people that do this, it doesn't matter if you won $10 million or $1. The fact is, we're consistently showing that these people are wrong, that this is what they're doing, that the system needs to be changed. And so I'll just ask you straight up, do you believe that the Department of Children and Family Services are unjustly taking children from good parents?
Absolutely. 100%.
And do you believe that a lot of it is financial motivation?
Yes, that's the only way to explain it, really. Follow the money. There's nothing new under the sun, right? Follow the money.
And so, in parting, what would you encourage parents that are going through this right now? Um, Anything else you want to summarize about your case or DCF? Feel free.
If you're going through this right now, I just say to pray. I know it's really hard. Sometimes you don't even know what to pray, but the Bible tells us, that the Spirit intercedes for us in our groans. Sometimes all I could do was cry. And God knows every tear. God knows everything you're going through. God knows the truth. And, hold firm in that faith. And practically speaking, first off, if you ever have a social worker knock on your door, you do not have to let them in your house. You have a right to know what the allegation is. You have a right to know what the investigation is. And if they don't have a warrant, don't let them in. No warrant, no entry. Doesn't mean that they're not going to go get one. They probably will go get one, but at least it buys you some time. My second piece of advice would be to get an attorney, a private attorney if you can. I know they're expensive, but this is your children's lives at stake. I mean, beg whoever it is you need to beg, sell a car, refinance your house, whatever it is that you need to do in order to afford an attorney. I would also say, shut up now, because anything you say can and will be used against you, even though they don't tell you. And even though you have every right to be angry at this point, you have every right to fight for your child. You have every right to feel what you're feeling. But right now is not the time. Okay, you have to swallow that, swallow the pride, put it in God's hands, and you just do whatever the heck they tell you to do. Because that's what I did. I didn't fight anything of the way. I took the psychological evaluations, I took the lie detector tests, I did the child abuse classes, anything, whatever you tell me to do, because I did not want my children taken away, and these people have that power. So fight later.
Sure.
Save all that up to sue them later.
And I would just add to that, do it wisely, because sometimes the psychologist, you got a class where a lot of people were suffering, but some of those classes are set up. And we have a right to go to outside agencies, get second opinions. I would say even, we had to get my wife a specialist, cost $600 for the evaluation. We raised for it on GoFundMe. He said, guys, we can't afford this, but this is critical to our case. And you know what? The community came together and it happened because we're all trying to help each other. So don't always believe that these other things are just what's going to get your children back. Sometimes it's part of the manipulation. Well, we encourage people the same thing. If you're going to fight, you got to fight wisely.
Right.
And don't trust someone just because they're a professional. Do your research, background the people. You have a right to get your own professionals. And I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to make sure people understand that, because your case is really unique in a lot of ways. And I'm really blessed to hear the outcome, because we don't get a lot of these stories lately. It really is a dire time in our country when it comes to family. Any parting words?
It is.
I know you just gave a whole bunch, but
yeah. And I'm here. I know my story is unique. I know I was fortunate. I know too many families out there who are not as fortunate as I am, which is what God has placed on my heart, is really to become a fighter for those families. And for the people out there who say the government doesn't take your kids away for nothing, for the people who don't believe that this could happen, that this is possible, like we've reiterated, I had absolutely nothing. Okay, nothing, no criminal record. I am a master's degree. I had my own business. We were the all-American family. And if it could happen to me, it could happen to you. It could happen to anybody. So before you judge somebody, if you're listening to this, please listen and believe what they're telling you, because it happens all the time, more than any of us would ever want to admit.
Well, I think those are fine words to end the show with today. Thank you, Rachel, so much for coming on. We appreciate your voice. We appreciate your victory, your faith, and hope that this video will help encourage other families. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next week with another episode of We Hold These Truths.